Before I open it up, I want to make a comment and get your reaction to it. It's not surprising to me that if you had political leadership watching the social media of both sides, Jeffrey Sachs talked about the way politicians today in Washington, at least, play to their base, the way they talk to their base. And they talk to their base in a different kind of language that really isn't meant for political leadership to have a discussion. It's interesting to me because I think part of the problem, at least in Washington, is that people aren't really talking or listening anymore. You know, I look at somebody like Senator Ted Kennedy, who's from my home state, who I worked very closely when he was in the Senate and I was in the House. I met Bob Dole for the very first time in my life at Ted Kennedy's house. I met Orrin Hatch for the first time ever at Ted Kennedy's house. Don Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense. I met him at Ted Kennedy's house before I got to interact with him in the committee and everything else. Ted Kennedy never changed his position. He was always a liberal lion, but he was one of the most effective United States senators of our time. People have to talk to one another, I think. And I think about Kennedy and what a good legislator he was and how much he's missed. And it just seems to me political leadership need to talk to each other, and as Lee talked about, you have to really listen too. Just kind of a comment, and then we'll open it up.
No, it's a great, can I respond just really briefly to say, you know, I totally agree. And in fact, there's research on this important issue that suggests in-person conversations work better than the online conversation. So I think you're exactly right. My one concern, and I think it's worth really thinking deeply about, is it possible to move our conversations away from social media at this point? Even though we might all agree it's better, especially for young people who are online 70 to 75% of the day, according to some recent data, you know, should we not, you know, also invest online? That's my kind of core concern.
Stephen and then Anna Martha.
Yeah, thanks. That was great stuff.
Thank you.
I got a couple of comments if you don't mind.
Yeah, I know, please. Yeah.
This is really exciting. I mean, first of all, one thing that you didn't mention that I'm sure you know about is that there's a very pragmatic incentive for politicians to become more radicalized.
Oh yeah, of course.
Because they can selectively access their own base. Mm-hmm. So, and that means they're gaining more votes on the margins than they lose in the center. The whole competition for the median voter is gone with social media because you can selectively address audiences. And I think that's a driver that, well, you didn't talk about it, but I think you probably are aware of that.
Oh, yeah.
So now the second thing is you mentioned the information, the social signal, the information about polarization, or in fact, the lack of polarization in your co-partisans very often. Mm-hmm. I think that's brilliant and very important to understand, but it's only one aspect of the whole problem of false signals on social media. Because one of the difficulties with social media is that it doesn't matter how absurd your opinion is. Whatever, the earth is flat, no problem. You go on social media, bang, you have an epistemic community, which would never happen in real life. Mm-hmm. You cannot be a flat earther in real life and have other people who think like you. And so the unique aspect of social media is to provide that false sense of support and false consensus effects. Yeah. And we know that people become more entrenched in their opinions, the more they think it is shared. Yeah. So the false signal of sharing of information is devastating.
Oh, absolutely.
Because people become entrenched just on that.
Exactly. Yeah. And just to take the second question first, you know, the great sociologist Robert Merton coined this term, the false consensus effect, after studying the kind of network homophily effects of conversational dynamics and political opinions. So certainly we've known this for a long time. And at scale, and when we get into social media, I think you're absolutely right. One of the most interesting parts of this research was to conduct these in-depth interviews with extremists. And, you know, here it's really interesting because you're absolutely right. There's a normalization of extreme ideas. They don't go challenge, especially, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier. Maybe it was Lee or maybe it was Jane at lunch, that a lot of this activity happens in closed groups. Like, you know, so there's no correction possible because there's a kind of verification. What was really interesting though, from these discussions that we had, is we really wanted to get the motivation of, you know, why do you do it? And what was most fascinating is, almost to a person, these extremists don't care about persuading anybody not already on their side. It's completely, you know, they engage all day in kind of partisan warfare, if you will. Some of them making elaborate memes for 10, 12 hours a day from what we can track from how many tweets they produce in a day. And you talk to them and they say, oh yeah, I know I'm not changing anybody's mind. So it's this kind of interesting dynamic of, yeah, it's almost as much signaling to your own side. And maybe that's what you meant by signaling, as much as trying to persuade the other side, which I think is, again, why we need to think carefully about like what is the goal of the deliberation or the goal of the intergroup contact. It's often not what we would like it to be. And if we ignore these motivations, I think we come up with a more limited. The first point about politicians and that kind of median voter idea, yeah. First of all, the one just clarification of the study is that of the people we exposed the experimental subjects to, actually a relatively small number were politicians, about 500 of about 4,000 accounts. And this is because the strategy we used was to collect the names of all elected officials in the US, but then the names of the people who those people follow. So, for example, we have Planned Parenthood and Fox News and MSNBC, who certainly, by the way, also have incentive to radicalize people. But we very carefully balanced the ideological continuum. So we had people both who are at those extremes, the type of people who now feel like they have to cater to their base, as well as genuinely centrist people, to the extent that there still are genuinely centrist people in the US anyways. And so the treatment wasn't exclusively political. The attempt was to take people outside their echo chamber, the broader kind of cultural, political echo chamber. So people were getting exposed to messages from advocacy groups and so on and so forth. So it's not purely a politician effect, though I think you're right that would explain some of the motivations of politicians. You're right. They're preaching to the choir, which is arguably nothing new if we're going back.
Anamata, then Lee.
Thank you, Christopher. It's just a very quick note. You mentioned that social media is not about knowledge, but about status or image, we could say. That makes me think that the social dynamics going on in social media is very much like that of fashion. If you focus on Simmel's account of fashion as a social form is a way we have to articulate assimilation and distinction. So in this case, it's very much in the social dynamics at work. No?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And also because of the radicalism, because in the same way that fashion, people who set fashion must be extreme. And then the aristocracy used to have extreme fashions that bourgeoisie followed in a very moderate way.
Yeah.
But if you want to set the fashion, you have to be radical.
Right.
So it seems to me that social media work very much in the same way.
Yeah.
And perhaps because of that, anonymity works in social media as a way of moderating opinion.
Yeah. I think
because you have to depersonalize or de-emotionalize the
exactly de-emotionalize or maybe even take identity out of the equation. If we think of identities as kind of lenses or filters through which we process information, it helps us explain why we become resistant to attempts to change our mind. Before we judge the content of the message, we judge the intentions of the person who's trying to persuade us. And if we think they're trying to persuade us for some political ends, we're going to throw up cognitive defenses that prevent us from being convinced. So I think you're absolutely right about that. The fashion point is really intriguing, especially because in some other work, completely unrelated, we used not Zimmel, but the great French sociologist Gabriel Detard, who has this really nice model of fashion, exactly moving to extremes and the moderates follow, but then once the moderates reach the extreme threshold, then the extremists have to move again to the extremes in order to generate innovation, which is kind of the fundamental paradox of fashion. So I agree. Very much follows that dynamic. We have another paper that shows, at least among advocacy organizations, we see that type of rhythm in innovation and content of ideas. Yeah.
I have Lee, Jane, and Marcelo. Lee.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up very quickly on something that Jennifer mentioned just in passing, because it seemed relevant here. So she talked about Liliana Mason's work, and I'm sure you know it, but I'll just very quickly. Liliana Mason showed that people, their real objection was to people's identity, not their ideology. That if you ask people, how would you feel about living next door to somebody who was pro-choice? I don't really want to do it. How would you feel about living next door to a liberal? Oh my God, I'd never do that in a million years. So it was the label that was on it. So it made me wonder how you chose the bots in your original experiment. So if exposure to the bots made them even more polarized, that suggests that they were pressing the identity button, not the ideology button.
Yeah. First, to Liliana is a co-author, and so I know the work very well.
Okay.
And one of
Didn't know that.
there's a really interesting follow-up study to that study, which if you ask people whether they want to live next to a Republican or a Democrat, you get a negative answer. What's really interesting though is if you ask people whether you'd rather have a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law who's from the other party, or a son-in-law or daughter-in-law who doesn't discuss politics, overwhelming majorities select the one that doesn't select politics, suggesting that the identity effect is actually maybe mitigated to some extent by the fact that most people would just rather avoid politics altogether. So it's an interesting, the social distancing function is conditioned on your preference for talking about politics in the first place. And given that the vast majority of the population doesn't want to engage in political debates, it's an interesting, addendum. I do think some of the identity effect that we are communicating is coming through social media, but I also think that's inevitable to the extent that the motivation of social media users is to express and again, kind of test identities. One interesting thing though, we did an analysis in the appendix to the paper that's linked in these slides that looked at the use of language about identity. So things like, do you use the term Democrat, progressive, Dems, Republicans, all the kind of jargon for those. My experience as Europeans know US politics better than the Americans, so I probably don't need to explain, but all of the lexicon, and discovered that actually when we looked at the biographies of people, when they describe themselves in their bio on a Twitter account or a Facebook account, it's actually much less common to use political language than you might think. And that's partly because, the senator from Ohio doesn't often describe him or herself as the Republican senator from Ohio because they want to represent all Ohioans, right? Or Fox News doesn't say the conservative news, they just say the news, right? And so it presumes this cueing effect that people are able to discern the political identities of people and have high levels of political knowledge. And again, if the research is right that most people are not very knowledgeable about politics, then maybe at some level they weren't simply reacting to the identities. Now, when they start tweeting, of course, and then they're saying, really it's the attack. I think the experience of being attacked by the other side that would, in our analysis, even motivate people with very low political knowledge and engagement to start engaging in political fights online. So we have a story about a very moderate Democrat woman from upstate New York who had never tweeted about politics before, and unfortunately, as a result of our experiment, began engaging in kind of attacks with Republicans. So I do think identity is key. I think, but putting it in this bigger picture, and the one issue I think that Liliana and I argue a lot about is identity is not just something we're given at birth. It's not Republican and Democrat. I think we really need to consider how the social context determines how our identities evolve. And again, that's why I think it's critically important to think about how the structure of the platforms interacts with the way we present our identities and ultimately the way our identities evolve. And that's why some of the stories of extremists becoming more extreme in the book that we were able to document by looking at their social media timelines for years really suggest that it's actually changing people's identities in really meaningful and disturbing ways.
Thank you.
I think Fox's line is news, fair, and balanced.
Right.
Chris, I'll be quick because I know I have to. I was just wondering if I read it right when you put up your first experiment, the Republicans moved away from the line, so you could say they significantly moved, whereas the Dems were still
Exactly. Yeah.
the vertical.
Exactly.
So the Dems didn't move at all, and
The Dems moved very slightly liberal, but it wasn't
But
statistically
it wasn't-
insignificant.
it
Yeah.
wasn't significant.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so the thing about that is that the Republicans moved when they were exposed to something that was identified as Democrat.
Mhm.
And they were told they were Democrats and they were identified, so it's kind of similar to Lee's point. But the second thing was there was no deliberation. They had no real ability to come back at them. Whereas in the second one, you expose them to
Yeah.
Democrats, but you didn't name them, so they weren't identified as Democrats.
Right.
And they were able to deliberate with them, they were able to have conversations. And
Right.
depolarize them. So to me, is that a reasonable story? to take?
It's reasonable, except that we never named them as Democrats or Republicans in the first study. So when we asked them to follow the bots, we simply said, you're going to follow, we're paying you to follow a bot that will retweet 24
Yeah, but
messages a day.
The ones that you retweeted were Democrat or Republican politicians or media pundits?
About
or-
25% were politicians and the rest were, advocacy organizations, media organizations,
Yeah,
and so
but
on. Yeah.
Clearly, they would be.
To the extent that people can discern the
Yeah.
identities of people, which I've come to believe is actually a pretty small part of the population that can actually do that personally. But I agree. I think the really important part of what you said, I think, is that this deliberation is very different. We paid people to interact over time asynchronously out of a public context versus the first experiment where you're right, interacting was, now people did interact. They did try to respond. In fact, we had one particular respondent who criticized every single tweet the bot made on Twitter. It was a long month. And, but then, it's not, that doesn't mean that Nancy Pelosi was saying anything back to this person. So it certainly wasn't the type of conversation. So I think you're absolutely right that that interaction, the deliberative element is probably key to the depolarization too. Yeah.
Last question, Marcelo.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's terrific.
Thank you.
The great Gregory Bateson, it was his master's thesis at Cambridge, Navin, which his father, by the way, coined the term genetics. And he was appointed, Monsignor, by Jerry Brown to be a regent of the University of California. And Jerry recently joined a group of us and said that was the best thing he did as a governor, to appoint Bateson as one of the regents. So Navin really gave birth to systems theory, to a general theory of communication. And of course, he has a very profound insight, right? This is a ritual in the highlands of New Guinea among the Yatma people. And what he discovered was a kind of a dual set of processes that the men would engage in this ritual performance. And that is what he came to term complementary schizomogenesis. And the second was symmetric schizomogenesis. So the complementary schizomogenesis was a dynamic where there is a momentum, a kinetic momentum that rapidly accelerates towards differentiation. This is the theory of fashion, differentiation. So if group A performs in the ritual X, you have to perform, group B has to perform Y. And there is a very powerful escalation.
Yeah.
He outlines what he calls the second fundamental process in the ritual of Navin, which he calls this idea of asymmetrical, meaning over time, instead of becoming more and more differentiated, you become more and more like your interlocutor. So it occurs to me that tweeting is a kind of a Navin ritual where you kind of accelerate what Freud would call the narcissism of small differences.
Exactly.
Is,
Yeah.
okay, you believe X, I believe X plus one.
Right.
And a kind of a kinetic momentum towards more and more differentiation. So the question becomes really, if you want to save, anyway, let's call it civility in the discourse. How do we get a machine like tweeting to more of a symmetrical dynamic where you find a common purpose? So I wonder, if you've reflected on Bateson's systems theory and the general theory of communication as a kind of another way of thinking about what these new tools are doing, which is not so dramatically different from all kinds of other ritual formations.
I don't know this work, unfortunately, so I can't speak to the relationship between my work and this work. I must read it though. It sounds really relevant and pertinent. But I think it's very similar to an idea that I do engage with quite a bit, which is Carolyn Sharif, the social psychologist, has a concept known as the kind of latitude of acceptance. And the idea is basically, I think it's similar. If you take an extreme person and expose them to another extreme person, they both become more radical. That's your X+1, I think, right? But then the kind of interesting part of her theory is that all of us have a latitude of acceptance. It's a range of different ideas that we might not immediately agree with, but we're willing to consider reasonable. And so a related idea would be in the middle, if you expose people to people who are in their latitude of acceptance. So you're not going to expose, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Rand Paul, that like very different ends of the spectrum, but you might put two people in the center and try to see if they could have a meaningful conversation. And we wanted to do this in this original experiment, actually expose people to both extremists and moderates to test this theory. We couldn't do it because of limitations of the survey firm that couldn't provide enough people in both sizes.
More funding.
Yeah. But this is very much the inspiration behind our bots that depolarize. So they're meant to tweet messages within each person's range of latitude of acceptance, rather than retweeting these extreme views, which by default, as Jane and I and others were discussing at lunch, right, is what social media is currently optimized to do. So we can't only all change our behavior. We also need the algorithms to change to boost, more bridging behavior that we can identify, by the way, pretty easily. You think about technology could be optimized to promote ideas that resonate across social differences. All of these companies have broad data sets about our race and our gender and even our political beliefs. And so it'd be trivial to come up with a way of boosting content that appeals to a lot of people instead of boosting content that just appeals to one side. And so that's my main prescription in the book. And I don't know if it resonates with the work you're mentioning, which we'll have to read. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah, my pleasure.
That was fabulous. Thank you.
Oh, thank
very
you.
much
Thank you
for
so
the
much.
presentation.